So I'm just going to go through what we're doing with supply chain and how you're ingesting software and libraries into your ecosystems. Now, I'm not going to go into, this is what I'm going to try and cover. I'm not going to go into a huge detail about supply chain. I'm sure there's a lot more people in the room that know a lot more about it than I do. Well, those people that was roughly there and generally everywhere. A little bit of background. We in Citi have been, the whole supply chain area is impossible to cover in here, as I said, but we do, Citi has a real extensive program looking at supply chain program, and we see this as a real holistic problem that needs a real tight look at all the areas that we need to fix. So we're looking at fixing in several areas. These are the problem areas that we want to hit. Now, obviously, we've donated to the Linux Foundation the SSF, or what was Fresno, or whatever it's called today. I can't remember exactly his name. The next bit we're looking at is what we call the secure ingestion, or CSSI. We did want to call it CSI, but of course that comes to a few problems. I did joke with John Meadows that we should call it CSI Miami or something like that, but I don't think he looks great in Bermuda shorts. And talking about John, he leads, I work for John in the Citi, and he's leading the CNF working groups on software supply chain working group, and he's also the board member. So this is all tied into what we're trying to do in Citi and trying to actually help the community and push that back into the community as well and help them. Okay. But before I get on to the meat of the talk, can I ask a few questions, a raise of hands? How many of you use an artifact manager to deal with your artifacts within your organizations? Like Artifactory, Nexus? Yeah, quite a few. Okay, but it's about half. And how many of you are ingesting your library straight into your pipelines, straight from the web? Oh, anybody? There's a lot of nervous-looking people I can see around here, and that's even with my glasses. That yeah, it's still nervous-looking people. Okay, and how many of you do any assessment on the maturity of your libraries? Hands up, anybody? A few. That's good. There's a few waving as I'm not sure. Okay, that's good to know. So I think we're in the right area here to look at. Okay, so we've got a proposal, continuous secure software ingestion. We're trying to socialize that, and we're looking for feedback on what we're doing. Is it the right thing? Is it not the right thing? And Citi is working with our partners, Control Plane in the corner, to produce something around this. Okay. A little bit of the background. You know, I think we've already touched on it in a few talks before with Crow and Martha, and also the secure scorecards talk given earlier on. You can't have a supply chain if you have no understanding of maturity of dependencies. If you don't know what your dependencies are and what the level of security they are at, or how old they are, or they may be maintained, I'm not sure you should be using them within your applications. And I think we can all agree on that. But what do you need to look at? And the scorecards really help. And Brian Russell from Google, working in conjunction with them on using the scorecards, but we're also using other pieces of their data. It's interesting what we should be looking at. So if you're looking at things like, is the maintainer from a sanctioned country? Now, for some organizations, that might not really matter. For American banks, it tends to be a bit of a problem. Inactivity on the repos. And we've all seen these questions before, with these, there's no controls or code reviews. The latest one, the NPM for each package, the email domain was taken over. They took over the package, and then they had control of 35,000 packages. And only because that person who did that was actually trying to protect it, it wasn't a nefarious activity. So all these things we need to start looking at to assess the maturity of the libraries. And I think that's what I'm trying to get to, is how do you assess what, as an organization, I should allow in? Okay. Historically, there's been no tools to help you do this. It's all been a manual process. You know, there's manual scorecards, as I like to call them. And there's an example on the screen. I don't know if you can read it. This is what I've been using for the last 20-odd years. And this was a colleague of mine when I was at HOD called Francois-Eric Goyomache. We came up with this spreadsheet. And this is what we use to assess the maturity of libraries. This is what we had to do for Department of Defense, because they wanted to know everything, absolutely everything about what was being used. And they still wouldn't let us use the binaries at all. Everything had to be built from source code. So we had to take everything, and then if you didn't trust it, you had to justify every piece of code, every single library, and then you had to write an abstraction layer on top of it to build it. Now, you can imagine, non-Dockerized environments, VMs were not really a known thing, quantity. So we were having to build all this source code for key management systems for Department of Defense and other organizations. And it was, even the Oracle database had to be delivered as source code to the DoD, and they had to build it from escrow, and it would take about 8 days to build the source code. So this is another product from my previous colleague, Jean-Christophe de Montclair. He built all this around this, and it was called Active Builder. I still think to this day, if he sold that product now, it would make millions. So I think it's, you know, there are historic tools there. Are they publicly available? Not really. That's the problem. Okay. Tools, as I said, tools have evolved. We now have scorecards. We all now have the best practices badges. There's other Intel feeds. You know, there's SBOMs coming in. There's Salsa. There's Vex. There's Kev. If anybody knows what Kev is, known exploitable vulnerabilities. You know, all these things is, how do you, as an organization, decide in a policy-driven way to actually use this stuff and actually action it within your organization? So, although they're there, how do you automate it and use it? Okay, and this is more towards the user and the user experience, the user endpoint, user cases, and that's what we're trying to look at. So the tools do exist. There are some tools out there that do exist. At the moment, most of them are proprietary. You know, they have limited scorecards, information. They're limited aggregation, because it's not just one form of scorecard or Intel feed. Okay, you want to normally aggregate across several Intel feeds, and they might not necessarily allow you that ability. Limited policies, and I mentioned here this about no separation between PURL policy. That's a pivot design decision we made earlier on, to take PROL as the entry point in, and the scan test. So sometimes you will want to, actually as an organization, say at the top level, actually I want to deny straight away this classification of PURL. I want to deny all Apache. Nobody's going to do that, but you know, that might be the level you want to do it, or a specific version of a library. We have that in Citi. We have our own policy around that. We say, strict, you cannot use this classification of library at all. Okay, or from this source, or from SourceForge, or from this repository. Just banned straight up. So that's one sort of policy. And then there's another sort of policy, which is the scan or test that you're going to run on your libraries to do the assessments. That policy is a little bit more across the board, and it has different implications, which I'll try and touch on. Okay. And we want to get rid of the toil. We don't want to give this to the developers to make these assessments all the time. It's, if you can have the feeds, if we have a policy in place, which they have to just look at and say, this is the policy, then realistically we can automate a lot of this for the developers and the ingestion and take away that toil. Okay. Let me just check the notes. I think there's something else I want to say. So, what we've been working on is automating the software ingestion and the grooming. So this is a continuous process. It's not just, bring it in, I'm done. No, every day. Is there a change in the policy? Is there a change in the Intel feeds? Anything that trigger, this might cause something else. We need to go through that process again. Okay? We're looking for a flexible way of setting an acceptable risk policy for an organization. It's too difficult at the moment for a lot of enterprises to understand not just the license. That's a big enough problem for them as it is, and the vulnerability levels. If you start adding in all these other data points, it becomes really tricky for them to know what is the right thing to do. So giving them an ability to say, right, this is a standard set of policies, you can change it for your organization, and then you can take that and run with that. Okay. Eliminate toil, I've said, touch that. Replace waivers. See a lot of organizations have waivers. We can do that with the PURL case. That's why the separation of policy from the assessment. And I've already touched on this as well. When we're changing any policy, we need to reevaluate every time. And how is that automated? What's the effect? And testing that. If I make a change to a policy, how do I know what is going to affect my organization? What libraries are going to ban if I change this policy? So I need to be able to run that. Okay. So that's what we're looking to do. Okay. Where am I? So, that's some of the aims. We had a couple of problems, I would say. Some of the ingestion of the top levels, or should we bring in the full dependency tree? For us, it didn't make a lot of sense. And people will have different opinions on this, but we thought if somebody asks for React, should we just bring in the React library? No, I think you can either use React or you can't use React. And if that's all the dependencies underneath it, and some of them we can't use, and that therefore stops you using it, we won't block React, but we'll just say, no, this is a failure because this library's failed, and give the feedback to the developer. You can't use this because of this reason. It's failing the policy on that particular transitive dependency, and we can't find an alternative for you. Okay? Package managers are a little bit tricky. How they discover and they traverse the approaches. So we've made sure that our approach is using a polyglot on the package managers to identify the correct dependencies in the trees. And it also comes into another problem that we come across about when there's a range on the transitive dependencies. We find there's a couple of failures that are occurring where the latest library that we'll look at for that range may fail. So we're trying to work on the next one that will actually transverse the other alternatives to see if we can get to an acceptable library that the developer can use. So if it says you can use versions 1, 2, or 3, and version 3 has got a known vulnerability you can't use because it breaks policy, then we'll try and ingest 2 and make sure that's in meeting policy and go, yeah, that's fine to go. Okay, it's quite a tricky one to do that because the package managers don't necessarily let you do that as a normal pull down unless to explore that tree. Okay. And one of the big things as well on this and why it's driven us a little bit within Citi is the work about looking at different assured suppliers of code. So Google AOS, assured open source, Alpha Omega. We want to take advantage of this. Okay, we want to be able to make a decision that somebody's ingesting Apache Log4j, and actually we want to go and get it from Google Assured Open Source. We want to get it from the Alpha Omega project. That's where we want to go and get those packages from. It does lead to some interesting problems downstream, which I'll probably touch on later, where if you're doing package relocations, and you do it under the covers, so you're hiding it, which some organizations do, that will cause problems. So we were discovering that we could possibly use a VEX information to say, this is Log4j, Apache Log4j 2.14. It doesn't have this vulnerability because of these reasons. We've actually transposed or relocated the package from Google Assured Open Source to the Apache one because it's not a fork. Okay. That's going to change over time. I think that's a different version. They're going to go, I think, we will put into a different version and actually put the onus back on the developer because it becomes a different deployment model and different issues for the deployers to say, okay, they've now told me I'm using a Google Assured Open Source version, but does that mean I have to update my package with the new version library and all these problems? Because there's different issues, deployment issues there. Design decision, I think I mentioned already, the PURL. I think that's for our use cases, that's what we do. There's nothing stopping anybody who wants to take the project and change that, but it seems to be covers most of the bases. What we want to do is with open source libraries, proprietary libraries, and also container images as well. Okay, and I mentioned the software, the separation policies. Okay. So this is a couple of the use cases that we were looking at, and the blues, this is our sort of our roadmap of how we're trying to draw this out in the next couple of months. We have started with, I know this is in just PRL, it seems very simple, but we want to take it from a developer's point of view. Oops. We want to take it from a developer's point of view that obviously they want to request tooling through their standard tooling. Okay, they want to use their Maven package managers. They want to use it, go into Artifactory. So we don't want to make them have to go to us. We want to integrate that into how they're using their tooling today, so they just don't see it. Okay, that's the aim. If they want to see why a library has been rejected, we need to be able to give them access to the evidence store to show them what the status of the scan is if it takes a longer time. Again, this leads to different problems, whether you have a clean repo model for production and you have a developer having access to libraries immediately, it comes with different problems here. If you're installing NPM or Python packages, what do they do on the install? You know, there's some issues there. So I think the deployment model is up to each individual enterprise that takes this on to say whether they're going to accept the delay or and stop the developers working on that library immediately, or are they going to let them carry on at risk? Depends on how they want to do that. And I don't want to, we're not trying to force that onto any organization. That's up to them to say how that happens. We'll just give them the tools to make a decision themselves. Okay. Notifications. It's so, downstream systems can make other decisions as well. So if we come in, we know we have a lot of compliance reporting within Citi that needs to know if we've failed the library. So we can inform our SOC teams, we can report on downstream systems to say, go and tell me everything else that's using this library, because we've now had an Intel feed update that is now telling us you can't use this library. So we now have to then go and really look through all our vulnerability management of all our applications within the bank, and there's a lot. We have to say, no, you've got 2 days to change this, you've got 7 days to change this, or you've got 14 days to change this, depending on the risk and scope of those applications. Okay, and I think that comes into the Intel feeds, and that will obviously cause notifications, but we'll get there on that. The next one we want to do is obviously the policy changes, the PRL policy changes, and I'll go through that in a little bit in a bit of detail. And as soon as a developer is, this is a longer term aim, as soon as a developer adds in a new library that we've not seen before, we want to make sure we get ahead of the developers. We want to make sure that, okay, if we know where this repo is and we can get a feed off it, we'll now start monitoring to see if there's new releases that are coming out. If they come out, let's go and fetch them and perform the policy checks on them beforehand and make sure they're in the repo beforehand. Okay, because some of the tests we want to do, which I'll go on the next slide, are a bit more, should we say, long-winded and could cause several hours delay. Okay. And the other one is about the scan policies. Now, if I change an individual package layer, what the policy is, that's fairly simple. I'm denying or allowing Log4j. If I change what I'm doing for software composition analysis, I go from we only allow libraries in that don't have criticals to change the policy to we only allow libraries in that don't have highs and criticals. Can you imagine the impact that might have on an organization? If I did that in Citi, I changed that policy, I would probably have about 1,000 bricks thrown at my head very quickly and told where the door is. So we need to be able to test the policy. So whatever changes we're going to make to the scan policy, and that's any scan policy, static code analysis, package explosion, software composition analysis. You know, if we're changing that policy, we need to be able to test it to see what the effect is on that policy change. Okay, and only then, when that's accepted, can you then commit that scan policy, and that will cause a massive rescanning, because everything that changes on it, all the affected policies on it, changes on it, will force a re-ingestion or a reassessment of the intel or scan data that's been harvested on the initial ingestion. Okay, we may just force the re-ingestion, or we just might do a re-evaluation of the scan data. Okay. Now this is probably the heart of the system. So, you know, when you ingest the PO, I'll speed up. Sorry. Ingest the PORL. As I mentioned before, I keep on hitting the wrong button. I'm going to look at a policy, and there's very simple policies on PORL. I would say there's a block policy flow, which I've mentioned before. I might block Apache Log4j for some reason, or there's a standard flow, or there's an assured flow from Google Assured Open Source, or whoever, and then there's the explode flow, like Python NPM. I come in, I can make an initial decision. If there's no policy of a library, it's going to go through the standard flow. We're going to come in, that's fine, or it's not fine. The flow will be selected, come through here, we'll do the standard flow, go and get to the scorecards, as Martha and talked about earlier on. We're using this heavily. It might not be just scorecards, it might not be best practices, badges. The aim we wanted here was to aggregate across all the feeds that we have up to 20 different feeds coming into the bank. We want all of that to be aggregated. Okay. Other providers that I know, they have different feeds as well. Okay, so we want to try and aggregate that. As soon as we've got that information back, we can go back, look at the policy, see what the policy says. It will come back and say, okay, carry on with the standard flow. Or it might say, yeah, do the standard flow, but also do the static code analysis flow. Okay. Or it might go say, actually, we might have a policy come in and say, you're going to get this library straight from Google. Okay, we'll still do some checks on it. The interesting ones, I would say, is probably going to be the more advanced flows, and that would be the DAS flows, the sandboxing of this. I would like to put all these libraries into containers, explode them, time series them, see what happens. Okay, NPM, Python, they do some funny things on installs sometimes they don't. But as a de-risk exercise for the bank and enterprises, I think that's something that normally is done manually. I don't think that's something, we can do this, we can monitor this in an automated fashion very quickly, especially with, thanks to Rowan for the suggestion of the Linux time namespace, about changing the time space and see what happens. That's a great example of what we would like to do and get those ideas in. Okay, and the last and not least is building from source. This will be hell. Okay, everything is different. I'd love to see, and this is not me going on about developers or repos, this is how difficult it is for developers, but coming up with a standardized way we can build things that we can pick up and just build straight away. If there was a Docker build file within each of the repos, that would be fantastic. We could all do this, build from source. So you don't necessarily have to trust the binary if you don't want to. And that becomes a real problem. I think that's all I wanted to say. So currently we're in early alpha. I can't give you a demo because I can't get access to Kubernetes on my machine, Citi, because it's tied down. Everything's tied down. I can't get access to our AWS SE environments to demonstrate it because it's public, so I can't do it. And I can't show you the video because I couldn't actually download it onto my Citi laptop. So I can give you a link. I'll give you a link. I'll push it out. But if anybody's interested, mail me. I'll send you the link to it. I can do that. That's fine. Initial focus is we've pretty much finished the alpha, almost production ready for NPM. We're looking to do Java, then Python next. And yeah, that's it. That's the end of my talk. Any questions? Or have I blinded you? 2 minutes. Oh, cool. I'm good. So, yes.
So yeah, in your graph somehow I saw that the Perl entity is kind of central to all the analytics you're doing. But Perl has, in my opinion,
So we have deduplication within the our software. So we have. If you look at the video, it'll explain how that's done, the architecture behind it. I didn't have enough time to do it on this one, but we do have a check beforehand to see what the status is internally before we do actually go and fetch it from an external repository. So we'll always check the internal repository first, see what the status is of it first, and what evidence we've done and what checks we've done on it, because the policy might have changed. So we're always rechecking that internally before we go and fetch it externally.
Attached to external databases like vulnerability databases which point to information on the public, so you have to do the semantic translation for your
No, so most of the software composition analysis vendors, we've now got Sneaker now giving us a Perl lookup on libraries, their vulnerabilities. Black Duck do as well. There's several other SA vendors, OSV as well has it. So you can go and get the vulnerability information based on Perl URL now for most of the vendors. And actually that's baked into OWASP dependency tracker as standard. So that might give you a little indication of some of the things that we're doing as well. But you can, it's a universal identifier that we can use, not only on the vulnerability systems, but also on lookup and ingestion systems. Again, I think I mentioned, I really like feedback around that, people to critique the design, look at how we can improve it. We're really looking forward to people actually giving us a hard time and say, well, how are we going to improve it, and come in and give some support, okay? Thank you for the question. Anyone else? I should mention, we're doing this, with our partners from Control Plane as well. I should miss. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chris.